Hey, good morning. For me, my days and nights are becoming very blurred. I assume it's the same for you because I felt the same way as a delegate. So as we wind down our conference today, we have a number of things that are still yet to play out, from door prizes to the Constellation Shootout to the last of our networking, etc. But one of the things that's an annual tradition of our conference is the Astronomy Update. And I know several people have participated in that, from Dr. Kaler to Ron Kachuk, and for the third time, Dr. Shannon Schmoll will share some of her insights into this past year. And in doing so, you know, the purpose of the Astronomy Update is to be able to take and bring elements of the past year or so, in this case, probably really 2, right? And kind of give a broad brush approach to it, but at the same time, take a deeper dive into the things that we might not know as much about, or could take and enlighten ourselves and future audiences. So relax, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Shannon Schmoll from Michigan State University. Go Spartans.
All right, if Mark is ending on that, go green! All right, so hi everyone. I'll go ahead and take my mask off for the talk. So welcome to Astronomy Update 2021. This is for the past year, so I'm going to call this a GLPA year. So I start collecting things immediately after GLPA each year. So it's like an academic year, but it's a GLPA year, so it's from GLPA to GLPA. There's going to be some things that technically happened in 2020. And there'll be some things I missed this year because they haven't happened yet. Let's go ahead. Are you ready to be updated? Yeah. Woo! Okay. So I want to start with a quick year in review of some of the things that we all heard in the news, but it's nice to reflect back on some of the things that happened. So first, the Great Conjunction. Who saw it? Where was it cloudy for you? I got to see it the day before and the day after. It was cloudy on the day of the conjunction. But this was a bright spot in a tough year. But no, really it was, because I know it was one of the highlights of 2020 for me, getting to see this conjunction. I remember we went out the night before the actual conjunction because it was clear, and I took the telescope from work and took it home. And we went and looked at it, and I had my kids out there. It was dark, there was snow on the ground, we were looking at this, they were excited to see it, and then they just started running around the backyard in the starlight, and it was a truly peaceful moment in a really tough year. And so I think this is one of those things that brought a lot of people together. It was really nice. Mars had a big year. We had Perseverance. We had the Hope mission from the United Arab Emirates. It's their first mission to Mars. And we had the Tianwen from China that had both an orbiter and a lander, a rover that landed. So Mars got some new residents this year, so that's pretty exciting. The Hayabusa mission. So we've had 2 comet sample return missions, and Hayabusa 2 brought their mission back, so that's back on Earth. This is actually a sample of the sample return capsule, or an example of it. It's not the actual capsule, but we now have that pristine asteroid, asteroid return, sample return. So that's now back. Speaking of astronomy being a bright spot, it went by way of toilet paper. In the pandemic, we had a lot of people bought telescopes, and there weren't very many around. There are several stories around that. I got so many calls last year, like, where can I get a telescope? Oh, telescope.com is a really great option. I've been there. They don't have any. Where do I go? I'm like, so yay for astronomy. On Saturn news, we lost Arecibo. Hopefully there'll be plans to rebuild this, but it was hanging on there for a while, and then the final collapse happened. So this is a very special telescope for a lot of different reasons, and so losing it, I think, was a very sad day for many astronomers. We also lost Michael Collins this year, so the Apollo 11 astronaut. He's the one who stayed in orbit around the moon, so did not land on the moon himself, but he played a very important and key role. But I think he's an inspiration perhaps to planetarians and astronomy educators, more so for his work with the Air and Space Museum. He was very instrumental in getting that open and was director for several years. And so I think he helped create an institution that I'm sure is inspirational to many of us. How many of you have been? How many of you love that place? Yeah, it's a very special place. So, in other news, we actually have a launch date for JWST. It's in French Guiana right now for launch. It arrived. It's very exciting. There was one comic I was trying to find that like many of you shared about like the rocket being like, JWST, are you ready to go? It's your big day. And he's like, I think I left the toaster room. Like runs away. This one's from XKCD. You can see there's this slope of like the launch date being delayed, and so we're doing good. We're 5 years earlier than this prediction here, so yay. So this, I think this is a prediction for next year. You will see some JWST stories in Astronomy Update. We also sent a lot of people to space. It was a big year for going into space, so William Shatner went. And he came back and had a very emotional response, and I think a message of we need more people to go. Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson both went up with their companies. And then we also had the Inspiration 4 mission, which was the first all-civilian crew to go up into space and orbit for 3 days. And so I think we're seeing a shift. This has been slowly happening, but this year seemed to be a turning point in some ways of sending more people up who aren't trained astronauts through government agencies, but we're seeing more civilians go up into space, and this larger partnership as well between government agencies and private companies. So we're seeing, I think, a new era of space exploration that'll be interesting to keep track of as we move forward. Also, if you know me, I'm going to put in the food in space stories. There were tacos. This is like last week. They had tacos in space with chilies grown in space. Space tacos! It's raining tacos. There was also a pizza party. Pizza's going to be a theme this year. I'm sorry. But there's a pizza party. Apparently not the first one. I went to go look up more information on this, and apparently there's another one too. But there was a pizza party. Also, there were mice born from freeze-dried sperm that were up in the International Space Station, which only means one thing for next year. Space pizza rat. Yeah. But that brings me to the theme for the deeper dives this year. So, okay, I was very confused because my timer says I've been going for 25 minutes, but I think that's because we set it up 25 minutes ago. But let's look at that story of freeze-dried mouse sperm. We're going to start there. Hooray. But this brings me to this year's theme of the intersection of astronomy with different areas of study. So one of the things that I love about astronomy that I think really makes it so special as an educator is that we can get all the people who just think space is cool. Who here thinks space is cool? Yeah, we all know space is cool, but there's some people who still need a little convincing, and astronomy connects in a lot of different ways. We have astrobiology, astrochemistry, planetary geology. We have archaeology. Archaeoastronomy is a really interesting area of study, trying to understand humans' desire to understand the cosmos since the dawn of humanity. So there are lots of ways to connect astronomy to different areas. There's the arts, Music, we know all of this. There's fantastic ways to connect all of this. And when I'm going through all the stories of astronomy for Astronomy Update, I need to find a theme to help me narrow it down. And this is the one that really resonated with me this year. Because we've also been seeing so many new people come and join us online that we never reached before through our virtual programs. And this is a way for us to reach even more people, to meet them where they are and where their interests are. So we're going to take a deeper dive into these ones, which is why there's going to be fewer stories, because I had to spend way more time looking up vocabulary. I don't know what this means, biology paper. So we're going to start with some biology, which is the mouse sperm. So there were mouse pups born using, on Earth, they were born on Earth, but they were using freeze-dried sperm that was stored on the International Space Station for an extended period of time. And so they had a ground-based control as well. So so that means, this is from the paper, they have ground control pups and space pups. Ground control. They're Major Tom pups now. Yeah. Okay, I will refer to them as Major Tom pups now. All right, so why did we do this? Well, like we saw in the earlier review, space exploration is getting closer and closer. We're getting closer and closer to sending humans to Mars. Before we do that, we need to understand what space is going to do to us and also other animals. And on top of that, if we end up with longer-term communities on Mars, if you will, cities on Mars or the moon or farther away from Earth than we've ever been, that might involve animals one day. And so we need to also understand how this would work. And radiation, studies have been done on radiation on mammals, on various animals. Sea urchins and worms, for instance, have been sent to the International Space Station. Mice have gone to the International Space Station. It's also been used with germ cells, so eggs and sperm as well. But those are usually based off of models from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and not a full understanding of actual radiation from space. And if we're going to do longer term, most of those studies have also been blasted with radiation and not so much longer term exposure from actual radiation from space. And so the problem, though, with trying to study that is sending up live animals takes a lot of maintenance. So about the longest time an animal's ever gone up is about 3 months into space. If you send up live cells, you still have to change out the culture. You have to still maintain those. And so it's very labor intensive, and there's weight involved. We know sending heavy things to space, even an ounce, is going to really increase the amount of fuel that we're going to need. So they ended up going with freeze-dried sperm because it's lightweight and it can be stored at room temperature for long periods of time. So they split the sample up. So this is how the experiment worked. Oh, you can set it and forget it. That's why it's better. I forgot to put that one in. Okay. All right. So I know we're starting with B, but they started with B in the paper, so we're going with B first. So the first thing that they did is they took fresh sperm and freeze-dried sperm in order to just test the validity of trying to do this kind of experiment in the first place. And they exposed the sperm with radiation. So you can see that pretty much any level of radiation for fresh sperm made the birth rate drop pretty drastically for mice. But you can, with freeze-dried sperm, you can kind of see it sort of tapers off with more radiation. So this shows that you can expose the sperm to pretty high levels of radiation and still have successful birth of major tom pups. So, told you. So that was successful, and this result we're going to talk a little bit more right at the end, and what that result alone could potentially mean. So then what they did is they took several different samples of sperm. They split it up into 6 groups of 4, so there's 24 samples, and 3 of them went up into space, and 3 of them stayed at a lab at the JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, in identical conditions. so that they could control it. So the only difference is going up into space. So one group went up for 9 months, which was really just a let's make sure that this works in the first place sample. It wasn't really meant to be a study of long-term exposure. The study itself was really around the one that was 2 years and 9 months, which they called the 3-year sample, and then 5 years and 10 months, so the 6-year sample. So they were up there for a while. Okay. And so when they brought them back, they then went through an IVF procedure, so in vitro fertilization. And so they first took some of the sperm and studied them, looked at if there was any changes, if there was any breakage within them, and so on, any damage to the sperm. And then each step of the way, so the fertilized egg, when it's split into one cell, into 2 cells, and then the blastocyst, and then that is what gets implanted into the mother mouse. And then mouse pups were born, and then from those mouse pups, they had a second generation to see if there is any more generational effects in this. And overall, there were some small but significant differences throughout these different stages that they noticed. But in the end, they sort of evened out, and the birth rate across all the samples were pretty similar. They did notice that the average lifespan for the major tom pups was about 200 days less than the Earth-based, the ground control pups. And so for reference, I went to look this up. The average lifespan of a mouse is about 12 to 18 months, but that's largely because of predation. So something's going to kill them in the environment, not so much what they could actually live to. So the longest a mouse has lived of this species was about 1,800 days. So in captivity, they can live a lot longer. And the gene expression for the offspring of the major tom mice were also not significantly different. So their conclusions from this is there are some limitations. This is only one mammal species, one species of mouse. So if we really want to understand this, we're going to need to do more with more species. Also, the ISS, they put them up on the ISS, which is still in the protective envelope of the Earth. So it's still not the same level of radiation that they're going to get if they go to Mars. So they're suggesting when we eventually have a space station around the moon, that would be another place to kind of continue this experiment. But a lot of radiation effects are a result of the particles interacting with water in our cells. So when you freeze dry them, the cells, you don't have that water to interact with. So this is actually a way of protecting the cells from the radiation itself. So they're trying to argue that this would be, one, a good way to send things because it's low maintenance, low weight, and it's actually a way of protecting the cells. But they're trying to argue that maybe we should have a genetic bank that's up in space, away from the disasters that we experience on Earth, sort of as a backup, and if we freeze dry it. So that's an interesting prospect. All right, moving on. Photosynthesis around M-dwarf stars. Okay, so here's our stars by their spectral class. Otters bouncing around, finding good kelp. That's my favorite one. I had my students come up with their own back when I was in grad school, and that was always my favorite because otters are cute. But this is the distribution of the different spectral types of stars. And you can see the most abundant kind are the M stars, which are the lowest luminosity, the lowest temperature. And since they're abundant, they're also really, and they're small, they're really great for finding super Earths and more Earth-like planets. Because when you are doing the transit method, for instance, the percentage of the disk of the star that is blocked by the planet is much higher, so it's much easier to see the dip on that particular star. So this would be a good way of maybe trying to find life around other planets, is to maybe focus on these planets around M stars, just for sheer numbers. There are some discussions on whether or not life could ever survive around M-dwarf stars, but they wanted to sort of explore this idea. So they wanted to do this with plants, or well, not plants so much as cyanobacteria, which are bacteria that can photosynthesize. And so they, when we're talking about remote sensing, there's this red edge when it comes to plants, and this is what we're going to need for astronomy. So this is plants absorb light. Did you know that? So they absorb light, but then there's this red edge where suddenly in the infrared they stop absorbing light, and so it looks opaque until suddenly you get to infrared, and then there it is, and you see it again. But that can shift with certain species of cyanobacteria to a much redder spot. And so they kind of wanted to look at this. These are cyanobacteria that they have a different kind of chlorophyll. The first ones are A, B, and C. These ones are D and F. Yay. Great naming. We're like astronomers. So what they wanted to do is actually test the cyanobacteria with an M-dwarf star spectra. So they've been tested with just infrared light, but never with a full spectrum from an M-dwarf star, to see how it would fare, to see if this might be a good option of something to try to look for around the planets. And M-dwarf stars have more light in the infrared than any other star as well. So here's our spectra for different spectral types of stars, and the peak is closer to the infrared with the M stars. And so they also created an entire setup in order to explore this. So this is really the first step that they're going to want to use and explore even more. This is the setup. It's this nice little machine. They wrote their own special software for it so it wouldn't interfere with anything else on their computer and interrupt any of their other experiments. So there's fans on either side. There's a Peltier cell, which is a solid state refrigerator. And then you have the chamber itself where you put the bacteria, and eventually they're going to pump different atmospheres in, but for now they're using Earth-based atmospheres. And then above that, you have an LED light source that you can change to tweak the spectrum to match different stars. So you can see it's not perfect for the M star, but it's pretty close. And then on the left, you have a sun-like star. So that's how they matched the spectrum. And then there's something that diffused the light to make sure it wasn't just like, boom. You know how LEDs can be if you don't diffuse it, right? So there you go. That's a setup. And they had 4 types of cyanobacteria that are all extremophiles that can survive. Well, one was not an extremophile, there was a control. Then 3 extremophiles that can survive with really low light or really hot temperatures or adapt to their environment. And they exposed them to the light. So you can see there's 0 hours on one column, a sun-like spectrum, an M star, and then just far infrared. And they validated it first by using just the solar spectrum to make sure that everything grew as they expected on Earth-like conditions. And they did this for either 72 hours or 240. This is the reflection. So the darker the circles here from the bacteria, the more photosynthesis it is. On 240 hours, it saturated. So they didn't really use that for the rest of the paper. It was, we know what saturation is on CCDs, right? So that happened. So they focused on the M7 and the far infrared and mostly looked at the 72 hours. So here are the results of the growth rate, basically. So up in the upper left, you see the control, and then you also see the growth rates of all of them under both the solar and the M7 structure there. And you can see the growth rates are pretty similar, even for the control. So even Earth-based cyanobacteria that's used to a sun-like star would grow similarly under M7 star conditions. So, but if you put them in just infrared, they don't grow. So they do seem to need some more of that other light. So this is sort of a first step in hopefully studying this more and trying to understand how we can remote sense a lot more of potential life out there. Okay, Martian radiation on plants. So we're talking about lots of radiation here. So these are actual plants, not cyanobacteria. So Mars doesn't have the same protection from radiation that Earth does. And so they want to understand how this is going to affect plants, because if we are going to send humans to Mars one day, plants are definitely going to need to be part of that plan. And so we need to make sure that we can effectively grow plants on the planet to help feed our Martians, if you will. And so, and Martian radiation can be about 17 times higher than that of Earth. And then you also have, so over here I have the cycle of sunspots. So when we have really large solar storms, Mars still doesn't have that protection. So it can have another 50 times higher level of radiation just from those exposures from solar storms. So they wanted to try to recreate this as best they could in lab conditions with more constant radiation for a long period of time with occasional blasts of sunspots and solar storms. So this was the plants that they used. So they used rye and gourd cress, largely because they germinate really quickly in about 24 hours on average. And they also did it in both, they've both been grown in both Martian simulant soil and lunar simulant soil. And so they knew that it had been grown in these conditions before. So the experiment itself put the plants in, some in potting soil, some in Martian regolith with no radiation as controls, and then they put more into Martian regolith with radiation and then a control of 12 in potting soil. And they were exposed to constant radiation, so they called these things cups. So the cups were in there, I think they were the actual cups, but they called these other like Lego tower things cups too. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure they're Legos. They look like Legos to me, but they exposed those to radiation and they absorbed some of it, and then they put it into this sort of environment that then slowly let the radiation out at a constant rate. And so that's how they were able to expose it. So this is a lead-lined environment in a hood. So they turned the hood off in their lab, and then they lined it so that they could protect everything else around it. So it wasn't the best growing conditions when it comes to light and air and so on. But they needed to protect everything else, and they did their best. Then occasionally they would take some plants out and go, boo, to get the radiation. It's the official term. To see how that went. And then they looked at how the plants did. So they range from about 75 to 99% germination rate, so that's pretty good. And it was pretty similar to other experiments that had been done in this area, and most of the plant parts of the experiment were 90% or higher. But after that, the dry weight was a little bit different, so they dehydrate the plants and then they weigh it to see how much biomass there is. And so that did go down with radiation with longer term exposure. And they also looked at malformations, and they saw quite a few of like discolorations. The plant wasn't growing quite the way it should, extra leaves where it shouldn't have. Things like that. And they also noticed that with more radiation, the malformations, there were fewer of them because they didn't grow. So there you go. So we are going to need to do studies, I think, on more of this to understand how we can grow plants on Mars for astronauts and what those radiation effects are, and really think about how do we protect plants from radiation effectively so that we can make sure we have food. So, because food's important. Okay, on to Venus. So we're going to talk a little geology now. So for a long time, we have looked at Venus, and we love it. It's our sister planet. It's about the same size and about the same mass, but there's some very significant differences, like the atmosphere, but also the geology. So we're planning new missions to go to Venus, and that's going to be very exciting. And so we want to know what to maybe focus on here. And so, and also as we learn, since Venus is more like Earth, if we're looking for other planets around other stars, we want to understand what Venus-like planets might be like as well. So for this one, they took the Magellan images from the 90s and they re-examined them to try to see if there's any evidence for more recent geologic activity on Venus. So for the most part, we have believed that it has a stable lid, which is something I had to look up, which is it doesn't move. So the crust of Venus is pretty stable. It doesn't shift and doesn't have giant plates like Earth. So that's what that means. So they wanted to revisit this, though, because they thought they would find some more recent geologic activity. And they did. So this is a basin on Venus. So you can see it looks fairly flat right in the middle. This is one of the largest ones. It's about the size of Alaska. And so if you look around the edge, though, what do you see? What do you notice? What was that? Wrinkles! I saw Diana doing this too. Yeah, there's wrinkles. So if you look around it, you've got this nice big flat thing, you've got wrinkles all around it, and so the rock's basically being pushed and crinkled up. So you're kind of moving it around and then that crinkles it up. And so they think that this is sort of a smaller plate that's kind of jostling around, causing the crinkles all around it. And there seems to be some level of rotation as well, because some of the crinkles seem to kind of turn into the flat area. I can't quite see that, but they saw it. So then they found more. Excuse me, there's more. So there's several of these. So this is more examples of the crinkles. So we've got the flat basin with the crinkles around it kind of going back and forth as it jostles around. And more. And more. So when you look at the whole planet, there's a lot of these. So there's some evidence of more recent geologic activity, and they're describing this as sort of there's these parts of the crust that are shifting around in a squishier mantle. And so it's like ice in a water glass kind of juggling around is how they described it. And there are Earth analogs for this. So this is the Tarim Basin and the Sichuan Basin, both in China, and then the South Caspian Basin. So we can study this, and this is one of the things that I really love about planetary geology, is that we have a really great planet laboratory to study, and so it really gives us a chance to compare what we're seeing remotely to what we see on Earth to understand what's going on. Now this isn't exactly the same, because Earth does still have the really big plates that we have that do things like bloop for mountains and bloop and earthquakes. So there's a lot more going on Earth, but there are some examples of these sort of isolated spots that jiggle around that we're now seeing on Venus as well. So Venus has some level of plate tectonics, just not near the same level that we have. Okay, last story. This is a long one. Okay, more pizza. So, who here knows about the Nebra sky disk? Okay. So I had seen it before, and probably heard a little bit about it, but I really got to dig into it a lot more with this. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Nebra sky disk is about the size of a medium pizza, hence the pizza, for reference, so about 30 centimeters in diameter. And it is generally believed since 2008 that this is from the Bronze Age, which makes it one of the earliest known human depictions of the sky. So there's a big circle there that's interpreted as either the sun or a full moon. You have a crescent moon, this boat shape, and then some stars around it with a cluster there that is generally believed to be the Pleiades. Okay, so this story is there's a paper that came out in this past year that was arguing that it was from the Iron Age, not the Bronze Age. So they did not quite believe that it's the accepted idea that this is the oldest. This would actually make it not as old, where they were placing it sort of right in the middle of the Iron Age. So here's early human history for reference to see where we are. So the reason why this is a little bit complicated is it was found in 1999, but it didn't get to archaeologists for 4 more years because it was found by looters. So people who go around trying to find historical objects and then they sell it illegally. And so it took about 4 years before archaeologists had it after it was confiscated after a sale, which was about the second time it was sold, I believe, second or third. So it was not found in a controlled excavation, so it wasn't documented properly. It was a lot of the documentation that did happen was from memory from looters 4 years later, who looters often do lie because they don't want to reveal where they found it so they can go back and see if there's more later. So there's some questions that come up around that. So this paper was trying to argue that they didn't think it was really from the Bronze Age based off of some of the testimony that came out of the trial early on. So one of the things that they talked about was there's these scratches. So you can see on the bottom left there, it was completely covered in this adhering soil, and there's scratches on the soil from when it was dug up. And so the angle of the scratches, and based off of where it was supposedly sitting within this, where it was dug up. So it was dug up with some swords, a chisel, an arm spiral that were sort of in the bottom, and then it was placed vertically next to those. And you can't really date this like you would normally some objects, like through carbon dating. So it's dated based off of the other objects. So you have to make sure that those objects are part of the same group in the first place in order to confirm that this is from when it is. So when it was dug up, just for, I need to go through that. It was dug up. They're arguing that based off of where these things are and how it was supposedly placed in there, it would have been scratched when it was being dug up with these chisels here, and that some of the scratches would have had to have happened from under the ground. So that's their first argument on this. They also argue that at the site where it was supposedly found, the disk itself was found about 3 to 5 centimeters, the top of it from below the horizon, the ground level. I'm going to call it the horizon. That's just what it is in my head. So that was really consistent amongst the testimony all the time. It was only about 3 to 5 centimeters deep to find the top. And they're arguing that there's this new soil that's much newer. It couldn't have been as old as the Bronze Age. That was 15 centimeters deep, or about 10 centimeters deep. And this whole thing is 32 centimeters, so that means part of it would have had a different patina on it than the rest of it, which was somewhat seen, which we'll see. But they didn't think it was the same. And this is a recreation of how it was found with all the other objects. And they also argue that the lead and tin isotopes from the soil samples suggest that it's not from the same spot. So this is a plot of the isotopes from different sites. And then you have the Nebraska disk in the bottom left, and you have a chisel from the same group that's also over there. So they're arguing that it's not the same thing. It was probably dug up and moved. And they were also saying that, checking my time, that the sort of more boat-like shape, or they called it a rainbow, was more common within the Iron Age in different civilizations. So this is why they're placing it in the Iron Age. So at first they're trying to say, this is not Bronze Age. We're not sure it's Bronze Age, and we also think it might be Iron Age for this reason. So, and this paper came out from Gebhardt and Krauss, so those are the folks that were arguing it's more likely from the Iron Age. So there's another group that's led by an archaeologist named Pernicka, and they're the ones who did most of the original research, and they came out with a much longer paper arguing back every single point. So we're going to go through that now. So this is sort of an explanation of why it was settled in the first place that this was a Bronze Age object. So one, they were saying that when it comes to that soil, the top layer, the top 3 to 5 centimeters were a bit newer, but that 15 centimeter new layer was actually from a spot a few hundred meters away from the spot where it was found, where there was also a charcoal kiln that they had dated to another time. So that caused changes in the soil that were not seen in the other spot where everything was found. They also explained that the reason why it was so close to the surface in the first place was likely soil erosion, because the bottom of the plate was still with all the other objects. They were trying to say because it was also higher up than everything else, that it had to have been newer, but it was vertical. So that's why the bottom still sat with everything else. Also on top of that, at the site in the undisturbed soil, right underneath it, you find copper and gold deposits that would only have been there had it been sitting in this spot for a really long time and leached out of the disk into the soil. So that's another reason why they think that. And they also don't believe that anyone was lying or that they would have shifted it, because during the testimonies from the looters, they were saying that, oh yeah, we remember finding a bottle from from West Germany, and this was closer to East Germany, that we found, and then we broke it, and then we threw it back in there when we were done. And they didn't know that archaeologists had already dug that bottle up and found it in there, and it was broken, and it was the right brand of mineral water. So that was a way to test the veracity of the testimonies. And this is a drawing. So when it comes to how it's oriented and that sort of idea of the scratches coming from underneath the ground, they were like, well, they dug some of it up, and then they dug more of it up, and then they were able to make those scratches after they dug it up a little bit. Also, they had dug it up about halfway and then left and came back. And so and you do see a bit of a difference in the patina. And you also see, the reason why they place it the way they usually do is because there is a nick in the top that is brand new that was caused by the looters when they were digging it up. But they're like, we can't be sure in the exact rotation it was in at the time because no one was there and it was years ago. Oh yeah, these are the dents and the different corrosion that happened. Okay. They also did look at the metals as well, and so there's a well-known Iron Age settlement that is nearby that used a particular mine at the time that a lot of material from that time has these signatures. And then there's also a similar one with a Bronze Age mine, and the Nebra sky disk fits right in the middle of the Bronze Age. And so on the bottom, I have some quotes from the authors. It seems characteristic for the argumentation of Gebert and Krauss that these findings are not mentioned at all. They were very annoyed. And what is more irritating came up a couple of times, and it rankles that, so on. So they seemed very annoyed that they had to even respond. And their argument was, they didn't bring in any new evidence to try to argue it was Iron Age, and then they ignored a ton of evidence that they did have that puts it in the Bronze Age. And so this is, I think, fantastic. They ended the paper with a table of every single point that was made in the other one, a list of every paper and article and presentation ever done that discusses that point, and they highlighted in red every single one they did not use. So I think we could say it's from the Bronze Age. Thank you. That one was my favorite. I almost quit astronomy and physics in my freshman year of college to go become an archaeologist instead, so I still love it. Someone talked me out of it.
It's not so much a question as in a request. Could you go back to the previous slide so we can get a picture for it? That was it. Thank you very much. And it was beautiful. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you. Who wants to break out into Hamilton songs now?
Regarding the new Venus discussion, you might have said it and I missed it, but was the new evidence, that they were talking about the crinkles, right? Was that from new data? And if so, how was that taken? Or was it a review of the previous? And why were they able to see it now and they weren't able to see it before? What am I missing?
So it was from Magellan data, so it is old data, and I think it was just a new review of it up close, trying to find things like this. So I'm not entirely sure why they decided to revisit it, other than let's look at it a little bit closer before we go back. And they started to see these parallels with other things on Earth. So I think there's been other evidence that there's been more recent geologic activity, and so they wanted to look at this particular one a little more closely.
Okay, thank you.
Jean has a question.
I'd like to ask in a gentle way, for those of us who are not quite as enamored with archaeology, astroarchaeology as you are, so it's delightful to learn from you. I need a little more context to understand what's the significance of it being bronze versus iron?
So if we place it in the Bronze Age, it makes it one of the earliest, well, it makes it the earliest known depiction of the night sky that we have. And whereas Iron Age, we have other ones after that, so it's not the earliest. So this is one of the earliest pieces of evidence of astronomy being done. It's not, and I mean physical pieces of evidence. We know astronomy's been being done for a very long time. And there's oral histories for that. But this is one of the earliest known pieces of an actual record of the sky. And so if we're talking about human history, and we're talking about astronomy, this is something humans have been doing for a really long time. We use it for timekeeping. We use it for knowing when to plant and when to harvest. We do it for telling and sharing knowledge through what we see in the sky. And so that's a piece of our own history that we can learn from and know when we started doing this. Or how we started doing it, I should say. We know we've been doing it for much longer than that. So I think that's why it's really important, is this is the earliest one we know so far, and maybe there's something much earlier than that. But I think, why do we study astronomy? Why do we study astronomy in the first place? Why do we go and look at something so far away and so distant from us in terms of our everyday life? And it's because humans have a desire to know where we came from and that we're all made of stardust, right? Like, how many of us have feelings like that around astronomy? And I think archaeology is also a similar way of trying to understand where did we come from. It's the same thing in a way.
I guess I should maybe clarify.
Okay.
So we know that we have drawings of what we think are astronomical objects in caves.
Mm-hmm.
We know of the Antikythera mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if we consider those two, where does your piece fall into?
So I'm not 100%. Where's my timeline? So we're talking about almost 4,000 BC, or at least a couple thousand BC. I think we place it around 2000 BC for reference. So.
Okay.
The bone calendars were further.
Yeah, that's true.
So I guess you're talking about an artifact as opposed to drawing? Is that the distinction you're making?
Yes.
Okay, so something we could pick up.
And this is also something that they've been able to see how it's changed over time. So they took pieces off and they added pieces on in different ways throughout a few hundred years at least. And so.
Okay. And one other question about the biology, which was fascinating. Did you get the sense from the papers that this is doable long term? We will be able to make food that's plausible?
I did get the feeling that it is plausible, but we have more work to do to make sure that we can do it right.
Okay.
So.
Thank you.
Hi, we have a question from Zoom from Dave Weinrich. Do they speculate what the Nebra sky disk is used for?
There was some of that in there, like potentially ritual use, and again there were changes, but it's still not entirely clear. Other than it was probably used for a couple hundred years before it was buried, but how it was used is not entirely clear.
Thank you very much for your presentation. What are some of the clues to the disk that the looters would have seen to say, dig here?
I think they were using metal detectors or something, and it was also found at a site that was known for finding things before, so that it was a known archaeological site. And so it's on the top of a hill in the city where it was found, and so I think they knew that was a good spot to start looking, and then I believe they used some sort of detector to know where to dig.
I want to bring it back to the Major Tom pubs.
All the way at the beginning.
So in that paper, did they mention anything about doing the same kind of thing but with eggs and testing that, or is it just starting with sperm and then eventually moving on?
I think they were just starting with sperm for now, and they didn't mention anything about that, but I think that it's clear that more work is going to need to be done at some point. But I think that's a really good point. Like, it's not, we need to be able to do this with all the cells, and so eventually we'll, I think, get there. But this is sort of a test run just to see, one, is this a viable way of doing this and testing this, and kind of and going from there. So. No, I don't think they have.
Hi, I was wondering if you could give me a little bit of talk about the James Webb Telescope and how, like, you kind of feel the short-term coverage and communication will be versus maybe like the long-term coverage, and maybe comparison to like the Hubble for like general public as to how they learn about it.
I mean, short term right now, I think we're focused on the launch. You know, and I think there's a lot around, like, this is what it's going to do, and this is how it's different than Hubble. We call it the Hubble successor, and I think, which is great, and it in some ways it is the Hubble successor, but it is a very different telescope. And it's looking at a different wavelength of light, and so what it's going to be capable of is going to be different, and it's going to look different. So I think right now it's excitement about something new, and it's excitement about something going into a weird orbit that's going to bring us new science. But I think after that, the science communication side of it from us might have to be like, this is how it's different from Hubble. It's not just a new Hubble. It is something different, and this is how we push science forward. Is that every telescope we make has to have a different way of looking at the universe to get new clues that we didn't have before. So I think that might be where it goes, but a lot of it's also going to be like, look at this pretty picture, you know, because that's what gets the public excited and in our doors, and then that's when we get to do our job. All right. We're done 3 minutes early. Great.
The other one, please.
We have just a couple things here. One of those is our group photograph. And we have a few directions. The photograph is going to take place between the escalators out in the lobby here. In your name tag, you should have, in one of the many pockets, kind of almost like cargo pants, I think, but in one of the pockets you should have a name card that has your name on it, and it has a little question here, color of my clothing. It can be seen in the photo. Since you are at a table, probably somebody has a pen, it's easier writing here than out in the lobby. Please describe, you know, you're wearing a plaid shirt, has a bunch of stars on it, or, you know, anything else that can help describe you. And, you know, we do know most of the people in the photographs, but when you get everybody together, it gets to be a little bit difficult, and especially with masks on. It makes the photo ID even more challenging. So if you take and do that. We're most likely going to line up in rows of 6 people across, and when you finally get in place, if you're in row 1, it would probably be helpful if you could put 1 for row 1. If you're in row 4, put 4. At least we have a much better idea of 1 out of 6 to make a good guess. So please do that. It helps us, and it especially helps Dale Smith when he's trying to put everything together. Yes, Jeff, do I have... Okay, so we have a half-hour slot to do that. We'd like to try to get everybody done or photographed out there, and then you have a little bit of extra time for a break. And please note the directions at the bottom of the card. Thank you.
I'm Zoom. Oh, yeah. I guess you just Photoshop them in, right? Everything he does, he gets cracked up. Yeah, my flight's
Check.
Cosmos. Small little crossroads, but it probably.
Oh, I'm in now. So I will. I'll send out an email.
check.
I mean, it's 2.4 gigahertz, so, yeah. Hello, interference land.
Yeah.